After requests I have decided to upload this book. Shadow Slave. Let's begin. Chapter 2201 Flowing Blood. The Song army faced the same hardship their enemy had faced during countless assaults on the great fortress in the past. There were no ramparts on the eastern side of the chasm, but the chasm itself remained. Crossing it under the barrage of enemy arrows and launching an attack from the shaky bridges was a task that would thrust any strategist into despair, and Sation was no different from Nephis in that regard. That was the purpose the Tide of the Ashen Dead had served. While the Sword Army was distracted by repelling their ghastly attack, the garrison of the Greater Crossing stronghold had time to brave the chasm. The besieging army had used war engines to shoot mighty steel cables over the abyssal gorge, which then served as supports to build hanging bridges. As time went on, the sappers improved and iterated upon both the war engines and the structure of the bridges, making them easier to raise and harder to bring down. The assault started when the cables shot over the chasm, and ended when all bridges were destroyed. The Song army, however, did not possess the war engines, and neither did they have a storied contingent of seasoned, crafty sappers to build them. They cut themselves from the other side of the chasm the moment they destroyed the original bridge that had connected Collarbone Plain to the Breastbone Reach in the past. That did not stop them today, though. While the pilgrims and the Sword Army clashed, the ash worms continued to crawl up the slopes of the chasm. Now that their bodies had already served their purpose and delivered the hidden army of puppets to the surface, they were free to move. The abominable creatures tangled with each other, fusing body to body with the help of their circular suckers. The seething mass of ashen flesh reached across the dark abyss, while more worms crawled across its surface to extend it further. There was one slithering tendril of ash worms rising from the eastern slope of the chasm and stretching west, and another rising from the western slope of the chasm, right below the gates of the great fortress, and stretching east. The two met above the darkness of the chasm, and merged together. Just then, the towering gates of the Greater Crossing stronghold opened. Human soldiers poured from inside, followed by the thralls of Beastmaster. The nightmare creatures were used as beasts of burden, hauling fragments of the dismantled wall behind them. The soldiers were military engineers. While the Song army did not have as many sappers, it did have some, even if they were not as skilled and ingenious as their counterparts in the enemy camp. The sappers laid the lumber that had once comprised the proud walls of the impregnable fortress atop the mass of ash worm puppets, swiftly turning it into the deck of a great bridge. Then, columns of soldiers stepped onto the bloody wood, marching across the bridge like a river. By the time the Sword Army managed to push the pilgrims back, the garrison of the great fortress had already stepped on the surface of the Breastbone Reach, securing a foothold and spreading to form a wedge-shaped attack formation. The 7th Royal Legion was at the tip of the wedge, and Saint Sation, the lost princess of Song, personally stood in front of her warriors, clad in enchanted armor of blood-red silk and crimson scales. Her gray skin seemed to shine in the radiant light of the veiled sky. Throwing a look at the dark mass of the pilgrims and the enemy army hidden behind it, she raised a hand and made a fist. Then, without wasting any time, Sation waved her soldiers forward. Her voice rolled across the bone plain, followed by the reverberating howl of the war horns. Warriors of Song, attack! For the Queen! The Song army rushed forward. The pilgrims formed the first wave, the thralls of Beastmaster formed the second. Human warriors were the third. Standing far above the battlefield, Sonny gritted his teeth. If he considered the situation coldly, there was nothing to worry about. Even if the Sword Army lost this battle, it would not hurt the plan at all. If anything, it would empower the Queen's position, making her inevitable clash against the King more equal. Which meant that the two of them would exhaust each other more before one of them reached their limit, and would therefore become easier prey. However, having spent months as a member of the Sword Army, Sonny could not help but feel distressed when the battle turned against his fellow soldiers. Clenching his fists, he muttered a curse and turned his back to the battlefield. His expression became cold. It won't be long, now. They will pay for all their crimes soon. Before too long, the Sword Army was buckling. On the ground, the battle formation of the Sword Domain soldiers was being ravaged by the pilgrims, the thralls, and the warriors of Song. There were vast pockets of emptiness around calamitous clashes between the transcendent champions. The Sword Saints were at a numerical disadvantage, and were therefore slowly being overwhelmed. In the sky, the chain breaker and the few remaining aerial echoes were locked in a fierce dogfight against the winged nightmare creatures, the ivory island hanging above them like a celestial fortress. The battle had been ferocious and chaotic, claiming many lives in a flash. The Sword Army had never managed to fully recover from the initial tactical disadvantage, and despite its fierce resistance, its formation was on the verge of being broken and split apart. Once that happened, the battle was going to turn into a slaughter. It was all just too sudden, and had happened too fast. Before the dazed soldiers could even come to terms with reality, they were already on the precipice of defeat. Screams and clangor of steel filled the air, and the once pristine surface of the ancient bone was greedily drinking human blood. The eerie thing about the battle was that despite rivers of blood being spilled, there were hardly any bodies on the ground. That was because no one stayed lying on the ground for too long in the carnage. Those who were lucky were healed by soothing white flames, while those who were not turned into empty-eyed puppets. However, the outcome of the battle was not decided yet. Because Changing Star of the Immortal Flame clan had not entered the melee yet. When she finally did, however, two figures barred her path. One was a monstrous creature wearing an armor of blood-red silk and crimson scales. She was Seishin, who had assumed her battle form. The other was an exquisitely beautiful young woman with a delicate build and pale blonde hair. Her eyes were hidden behind a blue blindfold, and there was an empty scabbard attached to her belt. It was Cassie. She stood motionless in the middle of the battlefield, not showing any emotion. Her expression was tranquil, almost serene, as if the ghastly nightmare of the harrowing battlefield had no effect on her at all. Nefis lowered her sword, looking at Cassie with a hint of doubt in her cold, gray eyes. Saws. She was only pretending to be surprised, of course, having already guessed what Cassie wanted to do, and what the Song clan was going to do, as well. But each of them had their role to play. The monstrous visage of Seishin suddenly loomed over the blind seer. However, even when the ghastly creature's claws rose to rest against her throat, Cassie did not move. Nefis. Seishin's usually pleasant, husky voice sounded hoarse and distorted, coming out of her terrifying maw. "You'd better stand down. There will be many battles, but you only have one friend." Nefis looked at the Princess of Song coldly as white flames ignited in her eyes. "You seem confident in yourself, Seishin. Are you sure that you can hurt her before I turn you to ash?" Seishin seemed to hesitate for a moment. Then, her lips twisted into a grin, revealing several rows of sharp triangular fangs. "I do believe that I can, but let us not find out." With that, she lowered her hand, leaving several shallow cuts on Cassie's slender neck. Then, Seishin said evenly, "Cassia." At some point, a dagger appeared in the delicate woman's hand. At the sound of Seishin's voice, Cassie silently raised the dagger and pressed it against her own neck. Her expression remained eerily calm. Nef's expression, however, changed slightly. "What did you?" Before she could finish the sentence, Cassie pressed the blade deeper, and a thin stream of blood escaped from beneath it. "Stop." Nefis took a step forward, then froze, gritting her teeth. Her voice sounded even, but there was a note of wariness in it. "Stop." Seishin studied her somberly for a little while. "I think it is you who should stop. Look around, this battle is already lost, anyway. You will gain nothing if you continue to fight. On the contrary, you will lose something precious." Answering to her aspect, the blood flowed faster from the cut on Cassie's neck. Nefis regarded Seishin silently for a while, her blazing eyes betraying a feeling of dark contempt. Second passed after second, with more blood spilling on the ancient bone. Eventually, she gritted her teeth. And shouted, "Retreat." The bloody battle had come to an end. It was a strange ordeal. No one had expected the queen to attack, but she had. From that point forward, the Song army had no way back, having abandoned their stronghold and given up on retreating to the heavily fortified main camp. The warriors of Song were as good as committed to one final, decisive battle. So, what they needed to do before that was weaken the enemy as much as they could. Simply routing the besieging army was not enough, since the surviving soldiers of the Sword Domain would be able to regroup with the forces led by the king and return to the battlefield days later. No, what Qi Song needed was a slaughter. A thorough culling that would deeply wound the entire Sword army, cutting its overall strength by almost a half, while simultaneously making the ranks of her dead legion swell. That would have been the soundest strategic solution, at least. And yet, there was no slaughter. The defeated forces of the Sword Domain were allowed to retreat, having suffered severe casualties but mostly intact. The reason why the queen had spared them was simple. It was Nephis, changing star of the immortal Flame clan. There was no saint among the transcendent champions of the Song army who could defeat her in battle. Even if they joined forces, the outcome was unclear, especially considering that there were other sword saints supporting her. The only way to defeat Changing Star was for the queen to kill her personally. Which she very well could do now that the final confrontation was drawing near. However, if Qi Song did enter the battlefield personally to kill Nephis and destroy the greater contingent of the Sword Army, then Anvil of Valor would without a doubt do the same, wiping out Song forces at the Lesser Crossing personally. Countless awakened soldiers would die, and plenty of saints would die, as well. The king would lose his adopted daughter, while the queen would lose 3 of hers. At the end, both sides would come out of the conflict bloodied and weakened, having gained no decisive advantage. Granted, Qi Song stood to gain much more from the ghastly exchange than Anvil. That was because she would not just be killing Changing Star, but also conquering her citadel, the Ivory Island, a great boon that could vastly improve her position in Godgrave. So, the cold logic of war still dictated that blood had to be spilled. But perhaps because the queen cared about her daughters more than the king did, she stayed her hand. The gruesome battle had come to an abrupt end without a sovereign unleashing their power, and the battered forces of the Sword Army were allowed to retreat. The Ivory Island drifted away, overseeing the retreating soldiers. Most of them had survived, but too many had not. The Song army watched in grim silence. Somewhere far away, in the hollows, the news of the sudden attack had already reached the ears of the King of Swords. After that, the very last act of the profane war of Godgrave began to play out. The initiative was on the side of the Song army, so they had the right to choose the final battlefield. Surprisingly enough, Qi Song did not lead her warriors south, but instead marched further east across the Breastbone Reach, deeper into the territory controlled by Anvil. Eventually, her forces reached the northern edge of the Dead God's Sternum, a point almost directly opposite the great precipice far south, where the nameless temple stood. Out there, with an abyssal drop to the distant mountain chain of the titanic skeleton's spine behind them, the warriors of Song made camp and started preparing for battle. They could not have chosen a more eerie battlefield. Here, the outskirts of the Hollow Mountains were extremely close, and the dark mountains themselves rose from the ground like a jagged black wall in the distance. Cold winds were blowing from the misty slopes, colliding with the heated air of Godgrave and giving birth to furious tornadoes from time to time. Most disturbingly of all, the colossal skull of the dead god loomed above the northern edge of the Breastbone Reach, its inconceivable scale dwarfing the entire world despite the distance. The neck and the head of the titanic skeleton rested on the slopes of the Hollow Mountains, as if on a pillow, so it almost seemed as if the skull was staring directly at the battlefield from high above. The unfathomably large, gaping holes of its eyes were full of impenetrable darkness, and its jaw was opened slightly, as if struggling to let out a harrowing groan. Or twist into a terrifying grin. The dead god watched the mortals prepare to fight their last battle in silence, cold mists flowing across the white bone. Since Qi Song had extended Anvil an invitation, he had no choice but to accept. Going after the main camp of the Song army and the Collarbone Citadel was also an option, but that would leave his own army camp vulnerable, so he pulled the forces that had been supposed to attack the Lesser Crossing from the rear out of the hollows, gathered the second siege contingent of the Sword Army, and marched north. The defenders of the Lesser Crossing were left in a perplexing situation. The force that had been laying siege to their stronghold retreated, leaving them with nothing to do. At the same time, they could neither march across the Breastbone Reach, since the king's army was in the way, nor return to the Collarbone Plain and march east, since there was not enough time. Therefore, they could not rejoin the queen before the final battle. So, instead, the lesser contingent of the Song army crossed from the first rib to the Breastbone Reach and marched south, aiming to conquer the Nameless Temple. It remained to be seen if they would reach it before the two armies clashed. However, the king seemed to believe that they would not. At some point, the marching army under his command absorbed the retreating remains of the greater contingent and proceeded to the final battlefield. Sunny and Nephis were busy with their own preparations for the last battle, of course. Nephis led the retreating soldiers, while the Lord of Shadows had followed the king from Vanishing Lake north. They were reunited when the two forces met and merged, maintaining a polite distance between each other under the prying eye of the king. Granted, the situation among those in command of the Sword Army was a bit awkward. Saint Jest, the king's confidant, had secretly gotten into hot water for killing Song of the Fallen, Changing Star's right hand. Worse still, as it turned out, she was not really dead. Instead, she was perfectly alive, and had been somehow captured by the queen on top of that, which played a large role in the defeat of the siege forces at the Greater Crossing. For most of the high-ranking members of the Sword Army, it was entirely unclear what exactly had transpired and how Saint Cassia ended up becoming a hostage of the queen. Some whispered that she had betrayed the Sword Domain, but since her extreme loyalty to Changing Star was well known, few believed these rumors. Instead, most of the Sword Saints came to believe that it was the king himself who had conspired against Song of the Fallen. After all, everyone in the Sword Army had witnessed how he was suppressing his adopted daughter, to the point of sending a few of her fire keepers to their deaths. Was it such a stretch to assume that the king would endeavor to remove her most powerful follower from the picture, as well? After all, the last time anyone saw Lady Cassia before the Greater Crossing battle, she had been leaving on a dangerous mission in the company of Saint Jest, and everyone who needed to know knew what kinds of tasks Jest performed for the king. So, the mood among the champions of the Sword Army was somber and heavy. Anvil did nothing to remove their doubts, treating the situation with his usual cold indifference. And while all of that was happening, one of Sunny's incarnations had traveled south, reaching the Nameless Temple at the same time as the retreating forces of the Sword Army met the contingent led by the king. On the surface, he was acting under orders, aiming to defend the citadel from a possible conquest party of Song champions. In reality, of course, Sunny had an entirely different goal. Entering the dark hole of his citadel, he looked around and let out a sigh. It's really happening. My, oh my. A dark smile twisted his lips under the mask. Far north, under the terrifying gaze of the dead god, the Sword Army reached the northern edge of the Breastbone Reach, spreading slowly to cut any possible path of retreat for the soldiers of Song. The two armies camped in full view of each other, with only a vast plain of white bone separating them. Soon enough, the white bone was going to be painted red. The future of humanity was going to be decided on that bloody field. One way or another. 2203. Sunny was looking ahead from two entirely different perspectives. He was Master Sunless, standing on the emerald grass of the Ivory Island. He was also the Lord of Shadows, standing on the surface of the ancient bone in the middle of the sprawling mass of the camped army. The hollow mountains, a familiarly chilling sight, were rising like a colossal dark wall in the distance, with white mist shrouding the jagged black peaks. And there, between his somber incarnations and the misty slopes, a titanic skull loomed above the world, looking down at the insignificant struggles of the mortal warriors within. Indifferent, eerie grin. Each of its empty eye sockets was large enough to encompass a vast city, filled with nothing but impenetrable darkness. Both of Sunny's incarnations shivered. It's strange, really. Considering the nature of Godgrave, he would have expected the skull to bloom with an ocean of scarlet growth, the abominable jungle spilling from its eyes like tears of blood. But even the jungle seemed wary of the dead god's skull, staying as far away from it as possible. Considering what horrors dwelled in the ancient jungle, Sunny shuddered to imagine what kind of being could have scared the scarlet infestation away. Even the sovereigns seemed unwilling to solve that particular mystery, which was why both of them had stayed clear of the skull. Perhaps he would find out one day, when he was much stronger than even the Supremes. He would have to live through the final battle of the war first, of course. His gaze drifted down from the dreadful visage of the titanic skull, returning to the ground. The Song army encampment was like a black line on the horizon, a considerable distance for mortal men, but barely a stone's throw away for a transcendent like him. They were close enough for his shadow sense to encompass the enemy camp, at least, if he wanted to attract the queen's attention. There was nothing but the abyssal drop behind them, and the Sword Army had already cut off all paths of retreat. Making camp at the edge of the Breastbone Reach, under the watchful gaze of the dead god, was as much of a strategic decision as it was a statement. Having their backs to the abyss ensured that the Sword Army would not be able to use its numerical superiority to completely encircle the warriors of Song. And at the same time, it conveyed a message: the queen had no intentions of retreating. It was victory or death for her, as it was for her men. The vast stretch of white bones separated the two camps. The armies were preparing for battle, but the usual clamor was subdued. An oppressive quietness enveloped both camps. The wary soldiers were readying themselves in grim silence, their pale faces contrasting sharply against the deep darkness nestling in their eyes. They had the look of people who had long lost grasp of reason, and were numbly going through the motions simply because stopping meant death. The promise of one final, decisive battle filled them with dread and a strange kind of excitement in equal measure. Dread because many of them would die, most of them, perhaps. Excitement because the war, which had seemed endless, was finally coming to an end. That said, Sonny wasn't quite sure about what this final battle was supposed to achieve. The logic of a mundane war was quite simple: two armies faced each other, and the one that broke first lost. However, this war, the Domain War, Realm War, or simply the Great War, as people tended to call it lately, was different. Because all the struggles and sacrifices that the soldiers had made were simply a prologue to the true confrontation, to the fight between the two supremes. They had spent decades quietly preparing to fight each other, developing their forces and moving game pieces into advantageous positions. Then, their domains clashed in a bloody struggle to carve as much power as possible and break the tenuous balance between them by subjugating Godgrave. Anvil had come out victorious from that clash, nearly pushing the forces of Qi Song off the titanic skeleton, but the queen had ultimately won. She had destroyed the House of Night, usurped its citadels of the Storm Sea, and set Mordred loose in the Sword Domain, thus diminishing the power of the enemy while greatly increasing her own. Now, time was on her side. The longer she delayed the final confrontation, the greater the chance that Valor would lose Bastion became. There was Revel and Gilead, too, who were supposed to be approaching the two remaining citadels in Godgrave, which meant that Anvil would not give her time and attack as soon as possible. But what would such an attack even achieve? Slaughtering awakened soldiers would diminish the power of a domain somewhat, but not as much as conquering citadels or slaying saints would. And neither of the sovereigns would let their saints fall without reason. There were no citadels on the northern edge of the Breastbone Reach. There was no territory to conquer here, either. So, as far as Sonny could understand, the two armies were preparing for battle for no reason whatsoever. If the sovereigns were sane, and they were, in their own perverse way, they would not send their soldiers to slaughter each other on this pristine white field. Ronobes. Instead, they would finally step onto the battlefield themselves. Qi Song had at least some justification to prolong the conflict, but Anvil did not. So even if the queen tried to force a clash between the armies, he had no reason to allow her to stall. The soldiers were merely a tool to tie the adversary down, a potential danger that could not be ignored, and would therefore force the enemy's hand. They were merely here to witness one sovereign fall, while the other ascended to the throne of war. Sonny took a deep breath. That is, if I understand everything. But he could very well be missing something. In any case, the stage was set. The main characters of the play were about to enter the spotlight. History was going to decide who was the hero, and who was the villain. Not that it mattered, in the grand scheme of things. He had done everything he could, as well. Now, it was time to see if his efforts were enough. There was no day and night in Godgrave, and therefore no dawn. So, the moment the two armies stirred and started to move was no different from any other. Master Sunless took a deep breath on the Ivory Island. Far below, the Lord of Shadows cracked his neck. It's really ending. Smiling behind the mask, he glanced at the looming skull one last time. Watch well, whatever you are. I don't know how this play will end, but it will definitely be entertaining. Chapter 2204. Across the wide expanse of pristine white bone, Rain was watching numbly as the soldiers around her were slowly leaving the camp to assemble into a battle formation. The 7th Royal Legion, despite having suffered severe casualties, was at the very center of the Song army once again. They were going to face the Knights of Valor once again, and endure the fiercest of the fighting once again. If there was something different, though, it was that Princess Saitian was leading them personally this time. Her grace and exquisite beauty were enough to take one's breath away. Today, however, it paled in front of a delicate woman standing by her side. It was Saint Cassia, Song of the Fallen, the transcendent hostage of the Queen. One of them was like the moon, while the other was like the sun. The eyes of the soldiers were drawn to the two saints against their will, and Rain could see a hint of a strange, dreamlike emotion ignite in the numb gazes of the terrified soldiers. It was a bit like the way Ray looked at Fleur, and Fleur looked at Ray. Come to think of it, it was also like the way her brother looked at soul shards. Which was a bit strange, considering that she had not seen him absorb a soul shard even once. To each their own, I guess. Rain did not know how Cassie ended up being captured by Clan Song, and was in no position to worry about the beautiful saint. Inhaling slowly, she looked at her shadow. Then, she whispered quietly. Is there really going to be a battle? There had been many battles in this war, but none as frightening as this one. This one would be the last, after all. The Song army had nowhere to retreat, either. Her shadow answered in a whisper. I don't know. It remained silent for a few moments, and then added somberly. Whatever happens, though, do your best to survive. I might be indisposed later. Rain exhaled. There was a strange emotion in her heart. Something she had never felt before, and could not quite name. The word was at the tip of her tongue, demanding to be spoken, but it was not coming to her. It felt too powerful to be a simple feeling, and oddly elusive. She checked her bow, and then said awkwardly. You too. Do your best to survive, I mean. Her shadow chuckled. That's the plan. He did not get the opportunity to say anything else, however, because Tamar approached her at that moment. The legacy girl looked like she always did, well, actually, not quite. Rain had not noticed it before, but Tamar had changed a lot from the young girl she met on the Moonriver Plain. Before, her stern demeanor did not quite fit her youthful appearance, as if Tamar was only playing the adult without quite having the maturity to be one. Rao's. She was still just as young, but there was a firm coldness and a dark confidence to her eyes that had not been there before, a kind of harshness that did not fit the eyes of someone so young, not in any kind of world worth living in, at least. Rain suspected that she had the same haunted look in her own eyes. All of them, soldiers of the Song army, had it now. The soldiers of the Sword army were probably no different. War had a way of quickly turning youths into adults, and adults into a broken mess. She sighed. Tamar looked at Rain silently for a few moments. Are you ready? Rain forced out a smile. Not at all. Her friend nodded curtly, then said in the same neutral tone. Well, tough. Hearing that, Rain couldn't help but laugh. A tentative smile found its way on Tamar's lips, as well. Gods. I was hired to build roads, you know. How did I end up in this mess? Tamar shrugged. You don't know. She hesitated for a moment, then sighed. Listen, Ronnie, I wasn't going to mention anything, but since you're asking, I'll just say it. It's because you're not very bright. No, really, every decision you make is unwise. Actually, unwise is not quite enough to describe it. Ill-advised, monumentally stupid. Yeah, that's better. It is a bit shocking, honestly, the consistency with which you manage to make the worst possible choice in each and every damn situation. Rain grinned. Considering how much the usually taciturn Tamar was talking, she seemed nervous, too. Her logic was quite sound, though. Rain sighed and shook her head, then asked in a slightly amused tone. You do know that Ronnie is not my real name, right? It was just something that entered her mind out of the blue. It was a bit funny, that none of her friends even knew what her name was. They could even die without ever finding out. That would be a bit sad. Tamar stopped talking and blinked, staring at her in confusion. A few moments later, she asked slowly. It isn't. Rain shook her head. Nope. Her friend seemed genuinely startled. She remained silent for a while, then raised an eyebrow. What is your real name, then? Rain coughed, suddenly feeling embarrassed. Well, you know. It's Rain, actually. Tamar stared at her for a while, then sighed and palmed her face. So you just moved 2 letters around. What can I even say? Case in point. Rain gave her a look of indignation. Hey, it's not easy to come up with a fake name on the spot, you know. You try it. The young legacy shook her head. I don't see why I ever would. They looked at each other, smiling. Their smiles were pale and fragile, though. All around them, the Song army was slowly moving, assembling into a battle formation. Across the wide divide of the pristine white plain, the Sword Army was doing the same. However, before two armies met under the radiant sky of Godgrave, three different battles were coming to an end somewhere else, far away, but promising to change the outcome of the war despite the distance. Chapter 2205. A shattered moon shone upon a shattered castle. The castle had always been a ruin, but now it was reduced to rubble. The rubble used to be surrounded by a deep lake, but now, the lake was gone. Its bottom had been revealed, in all its mystery and horror. Indifferent to what lay at the bottom of the lake, Morgan of Valor hunched over an alloy pan and looked into the fire numbly. There was a gentle gust of wind, and Nightingale landed nearby, greeting her and the other saints. Then, a stronger gale crashed into the remains of a crumbling wall that protected the fire, and a small pebble fell from it down toward the pan. Morgan did not move, allowing the pebble to fall into the pan. A few moments later, she sighed heavily. I'm sick of it. How many times had it been, already? The day repeated itself endlessly. Each time, she gathered her saints and faced her brother in battle. Each time, they lost miserably and died. Over and over again, she suffered the pain of her body being torn apart and broken, activating the enchantment that reset time at the last moment. Rinse and repeat. It had been somewhat exciting at first. Morgan did not enjoy losing, but she loved battle. So, this closed loop of endless warfare was like a playground for her, a lethal and vicious playground, but a fascinating one nonetheless. Her brother, too, was a perfect enemy. He was strong, cunning, ruthless, and hateful, a worthy adversary for her own insidious mind, at last. Even better, he somehow retained the memories of all their previous battles, so the strategies he employed against her were both varied and increasingly diabolical. But the novelty had quickly grown old. Nobody was fond of hitting their head against a wall, after all. And Mordred was indeed a wall, an unbreakable barrier that she could not overcome, no matter how earnestly she tried. The power disparity was too vast. The resource distribution was too uneven. Even though the champions under her command had proven to be far more formidable than her already quite flattering evaluation of them, especially the three government saints, the transcendent vessels Mordred controlled were deadlier. There were the nightmare creatures he kept subjugating, as well. And even though they were fighting on a battlefield of her choosing, the ruins of True Bastion failed to contain Mordred in the end. She had hoped that the others would stifle him, maybe even destroy him. But although her brother had been held back by the threat of these eerie beings for a while, he seemed to have learned how to escape them eventually. During one of the more desperate battles, Morgan had even employed a perilous strategy to draw them forth. Using her transcendent form, she fashioned her body into a flat plane of polished steel that towered above the ruins like a replica of the Great Mirror, reflecting the shattered moon and the broken castle back upon the world. The swarm of the others she had unleashed was a terror to behold, and resulted in some of the most harrowing deaths she witnessed even after months spent in the endless loop of hopeless battles. And yet, her brother had survived their onslaught for far longer than she had. Looking back, that was the breaking point when this endless death loop had gone from tiresome to tedious. And over many lost battles after that, Morgan had slowly grown numb. There was a difference between being defeated and surrendering to defeat, and while she was neither ready to nor capable of surrendering, it was getting hard to remember what she was fighting for, to begin with. Desire. Morgan often thought back to what her brother had told her during the Battle of the Black Skull. He had said that his desire to kill her was stronger than her desire to kill him, and that was why he was stronger. Back then, she had dismissed his words as mockery, and an indication of the difference in their technique, perhaps. Her brother was perfectly willing to sacrifice his body to achieve victory. He had plenty of those to spare, after all. But Morgan was held back by the deeply human need to keep herself away from harm, which gave him a profound tactical advantage in a sword fight. But now, she was starting to suspect that there was a deeper meaning to what her brother had said. Resolve, determination, conviction, those weren't simply empty words, not to powerful beings like them. All these passions were born of desire and fueled by it. Desire was the source of all virtues, as well as of all sins. Mordred was driven by his ardent desire to avenge himself on his family, and while his wicked passion was as twisted as he was himself, what did Morgan have to offer in turn? The desire to win, to prove herself worthy, to earn the approval of their father, Or, if not, then to at least save herself the biting shame of disappointing him. All those were too abstract, too empty. They had not seemed like that before, but they did now. More than that, these wishes had been forced upon her by others instead of coming from within her own soul. These small and meddlesome desires were only worthy of a princess who had been raised to be a tool. They were not fit to be called a passion. Morgan was not really passionate about anything, except maybe the pure art of war and combat itself. But that was not enough. Her heart was not really in the battle, at least not to the degree this battle demanded. And, therefore, she could not win. Luckily, she did not need to win. She just needed to hold out. Out there in Godgrave, the final battle was swiftly approaching. A few more loops, and she would have accomplished her goal without even managing to defeat her brother. How ironic was that? Even knowing that the end was near, though, Morgan could not get herself to feel any excitement. She was tired, and all of it just all seemed senseless. Damn, the stew is ruined. Wincing, Morgan extended a hand and fished the pebble out of the pan. Dropping it to the ground, she looked at the stew without much appetite. Dinner is ready. Her voice was subdued. Nightingale gave her a strange look. She had developed a bit of tolerance to his looks by now, but still, the man was obnoxiously handsome even when he felt unsure. It used to make her want to tease him more. He was probably considering if she had been replaced by one of the others now, full of trepidation. Well, maybe not. The government saints had changed in the last few loops. It was barely noticeable, but Morgan had spent too many repeating days in their company to miss the subtle difference. Maybe they were the ones replaced by the others. She smiled slightly. No, of course not. There was a much simpler answer to their changed attitudes. Even without her telling them, they somehow knew about the loop. Chapter 2206. Morgan was almost certain that Soul Reaper, raised by wolves, and Nightingale had become aware of the loop. They did not seem quite capable of retaining their memories, at least not yet, but something, or someone, was informing them of what was going on at the start of each new day. The signs were subtle, but indisputable. Their reactions had changed subtly, and the words they spoke did not always match what they had usually said before. There was also that one time when raised by wolves had disappeared somewhere for almost an hour, then returned with a deep sense of discomfort hiding in the depths of her hazel eyes. Morgan noted all these changes, but stayed silent about them. It was not that difficult for someone locked in this loop to become aware of it. After all, it was merely a bubble of repeating time, vast enough to encompass the ruins of True Bastion and the surrounding lands, but relatively small in the grand scheme of things. Time continued to flow outside of the bubble, and the world continued to spin. If the dream realm even spun around an orbit, of course. Morgan was familiar with events that had taken place inside the tomb of Ariel, not the least of all because of the strangely detailed exploration report published by an anonymous author, whom Clan Valor had failed to find despite great efforts. The hourglass enchantment functioned similarly to the great river created by the Demon of Dread, but on a much smaller scale. In any case, while communicating with the outside world was difficult, it was not impossible. Morgan herself was receiving news of how the war proceeded in Godgrave from time to time. Her brother probably had a vessel or two hidden somewhere outside the bubble, without a doubt. That was most likely how he was able to retain the memories of their previous battles, even. So, the government saints could have very well received a communication from the outside world themselves, either a repeating one that informed them of the situation every day, or simply something that stayed with them as they returned to the past. In fact, it was not even necessary for the information to come from the outside. Mordred himself could have contacted them, striking some kind of deal. Morgan smiled faintly. Was that it? Was she going to be betrayed? Had he already infected her subordinates, not by consuming their souls, but simply by convincing them with sweet words? Betrayal was always a possibility. Every person had a key, some could be bought, some could be coerced. Some could be deceived, while some only needed to be given an opportunity to stab others in the back. Morgan had been on both sides of this equation enough times to know that trusting anyone fully was a foolish sentiment. That said, she could not quite imagine Soul Reaper or Raised by Wolves striking a deal with Mordred after fighting side by side with the surviving saints of the House of Night for so long. Least of all Nightingale, the inflexible boar. So, their newfound awareness had most likely come from her dear sister, Changing Star. They had been members of her cohort once, after all, and although life led them to different paths, a connection like that was not easily broken by political affiliation. So, what was Neffy's scheming? Suddenly, betrayal seemed even more inevitable. Morgan chuckled and looked at Nightingale with an amused smile. No, I am not one of the others. Come eat, everyone. The food is getting cold. Betrayal or not, she did not really care. So, Morgan pretended to be oblivious to their tense gazes and took the pan off the fire, ready to scoop the stew into the bowls. They ate their food, like they always did. And then, they prepared for battle, like they always did. And then, the moonlit ruins became a hellscape where monsters and demigods tore each other apart in a mad feast of destruction and blood, like they always did. The gargantuan forms of Typhaon and Gnosis moved across the shallow lake. Streams of starlight rained from the night sky, devastating the land. The titanic form of a steel goddess plummeted from the slopes of the mountain and landed in the drowned city below, making the world quake. A cold mist was spreading from within the ruins, and the haunting song of a night dragon permeated the dark sky. Raising her sword, Morgan struggled with an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. Why was she persisting? Surely, this senseless, never-ending slaughter was too much for a sane person to endure. Her desire to win was nothing more than a malignant sense of obligation. Her desire to prove herself to others had turned to ash a long time ago, after she learned that those who would deem her unworthy were themselves not worthy of casting judgment on her. Ao Beta. Her desire to earn the approval of her father, to not become a disappointment in his cold, uncaring eyes, had lost all meaning as well, at some point. Why was that? As Mordred's vessels were destroyed one after another, and her saints fell one after another, their blood painting the ruins red, Morgan took a deep breath. Was it because she had become disappointed in him, as well? Probably, yes. Not that he would care. So why was she fighting? A dark grin twisted Morgan's lips. Well, was it not simply because she liked it? Her desire to win might not have been as powerful as her brother's overwhelming, hate-fueled passion, but she had her pride, as well. She hated to lose. And that was reason enough for her to persist and fight for these ruins until the sky itself broke apart, and the pieces of the shattered moon fell down like a rain of fire. Simply because she was too stubborn to give up, and knew how to appreciate a good battle. A good war. Yeah, I like it. It's nice. Morgan was going to stop her brother, not for anyone else, but solely for herself. Pale moonlight reflected from the blade of her sword as Morgan jumped from the ruined wall to face Mordred. Like she always did. Chapter 2207. Their battle was just as furious as always, but it felt a little different. Because Morgan was tired, and because she was enjoying herself a little bit more. She was strong, she was fearsome. Her aspect was brimming with dire power, one that was sharp enough to cut down anything and anyone who stood in her way. Or so she had thought before. Over the past months, though, Morgan's edge had become a little dull. Any sword would lose its sharpness if someone kept hammering it against a hard surface, after all, and her brother's vile presence was much too difficult to cut. Still, Morgan met him once again, and fought him once again. By now, they knew the depths of each other's lethality all too well. She was a tide of living metal that drowned and shredded everything it touched. He was an insidious fiend who used stolen bodies and overwhelming force to exhaust and strangle his enemies, leaving them no chance to survive. The ruins shuddered and turned to dust as Morgan battled Mordred and his transcendent vessels. The wave of liquid metal flowed through them like a tide, enveloping the few remaining structures and toppling them one after another. The lumbering figures of Mordred's stolen bodies pursued, tearing at it with their fangs, their claws, and the power of their aspects. Some of them drowned in her flowing form and were eviscerated, while others managed to deal damage and bring her agony before being cut down. Morgan felt a strange divide within herself. She was enjoying the furious abandonment of battle. But at the same time, she felt like she was simply going through the motions. It was both exhilarating and tedious in equal measure. She wanted to stop. But she did not, could not. She refused to. As her reserves of essence dwindled and her voluminous steel body slowly shrank as more and more of the liquid metal was frozen, annihilated, or swallowed by rust and corrosion, the mocking words of her brother pursued her. "Ah, dear sister, aren't you repeating yourself? You contorted your transcendent form into this hideous sword apparition 7 battles ago. Or was it 5? Ah, but it had fewer hands back then, I guess. Still, do you really think that a few additional blades will save you? Oh, look, isn't it Saint Knave? Seems like he is missing his head, poor fellow. Goodness gracious, didn't he have a daughter? I guess you'll have to break the news to her soon. If you manage to run away from me again, of course. Have you heard? They are chanting the name of Changing Star all over the world. Dear father has always preferred her to you, and now, the whole world does too. They have already forgotten your name, Morgan. Was there a second princess in the sword domain? Who? That is what they are saying, or so I've heard. Morgan laughed. As if she cared. Dismissing her transcendent form and rolling down from a pile of rubble, she spat a mouthful of blood and rose to her feet shakily, using her sword as support. Then, she looked around with a pale smile. Oh, look, all your vessels are dead. Her smile faltered, though, when more blood flowed out of her mouth. Morgan bent in a painful coughing fit, then straightened and wiped her mouth tiredly. And also, do you ever shut up? Why do people even call you the Prince of Nothing? They really should call you the Prince of Running His Mouth, instead, acute BS. As Mordred, his original body, jumped down from the ruins of a tall wall and landed softly a dozen or so meters away, she looked at him and grinned. Right, it's because you were discarded by our father like trash, then tossed aside by the Dreamspawn like trash. You know what they say, one man's trash is another man's treasure. Doesn't seem to apply to you, though, bastard. Her brother's smile grew a little forced. At least she wanted to believe that it did. Mordred chuckled. I'll enjoy ripping out that dirty tongue of yours, sister, again. Morgan struggled to raise her sword and smiled. Do try. He descended upon her like a natural disaster. Technically, Morgan was stronger than her brother. Her aspect bestowed many boons upon her, after all, while his had little to do with direct confrontation. However, she was wounded and exhausted after dealing with the vessels, and he was a titan, as well, while she was a mere beast. Their power was almost evenly matched. Almost. In the end, Morgan still lost. Her sword clattered as it slid across the ground, and she staggered back, falling to her knees. Her severed hand landed a few meters away, fingers twitching as crimson blood seeped into the rubble. Ah, the pain was exquisite. Mordred glanced at her twitching hand, then looked at her with a pleasant smile. Well, that surely brings back memories. Should I take your eye, as well? That would be fitting, I think. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. He seemed to be in a strangely good mood. Her brother always acted as if life was infinitely amusing, but today, his satisfaction seemed genuine for the first time. That filled Morgan with a sudden feeling of dread. She suppressed a groan and stared at him firmly. What are you so happy about, bastard? Mordred scratched his head. You keep calling me a bastard on purpose, don't you? How pitiful. At least I didn't kill our mother, you know. Then, laughing, he walked over to Morgan and loomed above her, looking down with a twisted smile. I'll let it go today, though. There's cause for celebration. After all, I have finally won. Morgan's eyes narrowed, and she pushed some air into her crushed lungs before saying through gritted teeth. Have you lost what little remains of your mind? You've won nothing, abomination. I might have lost again, but we will just continue to repeat this battle over, and over, and over again, until you are defeated. I have plenty of patience, believe me. I am willing to fight you until the world ends, if need be. Mordred stared at her for a while, then threw his head back and laughed. I have no doubt. My stubborn sister, but you don't really need to defeat me, do you? You just need to keep losing until our father clashes with Kisong in battle. Morgan just stared at him silently. They both knew it, so why was he mentioning it today? Mordred's smile slowly drained away, and he looked at her with a cold, dark expression. What you failed to account for, though, is that I don't need to win here either. Her eyes widened slightly, and she winced, struggling to contain the pain. Her brother chuckled. You've been defending Bastion so bravely, sister, so valiantly, but I don't really need to conquer it, do I? I just need to make sure that it is lost to our father. That it ceases to be a part of his domain, and therefore robs him of its power. Morgan swayed a little. What are you? I am still in control of Bastion. It is still mine. And you can't take it from me, no matter how hard you try. Crouching in front of her, Mordred leaned forward and whispered, his insidious voice flowing into her ear like honey. Exactly. It is yours, not our father's. It used to be a part of the sword domain simply because you were loyal to the king. Where is your loyalty now, though, Morgan? How much of it is left? She shivered. Mordred looked at her coldly and said with chilling indifference, all pretense of being a human lost from his voice. You might pretend otherwise, but we both know, none of it is left, now. I helped you get rid of it. In these godforsaken ruins, I drained you of every drop of faith you had left in our father, and now, you are lost to him. He has lost you, and therefore. Her brother stood up and looked down with a dark and triumphant expression. He has lost Bastion, as well. My mission is complete. Taking a step back, he looked up at the shattered moon and exploded with laughter. Ah, it would have been so nice, so lovely to wrench control of this damned castle from your hands, but this is even sweeter, I think. Morgan stared at him in stunned horror, numbly searching her soul for any lingering attachment to their father, to his kingdom, to his great domain. But just like her brother had said, she could not find anything. No. Wait. Stopping his laughter, Mordred lowered his head and looked at her darkly. His lips twisted into a faint smile. Time to die, sister. Morgan stared back at him. She lingered for a moment, and then said weakly. Go to hell. With that, she activated the hourglass enchantment. The tide of time was turned back once more. But even so, nothing could change the outcome of their battle, this time. Chapter 2208. The femur of the dead deity turned from a great inclined plane into a labyrinth of vast, deep canyons near its southern edge, the end of Godgrave. That was because both legs of the titanic skeleton had been shattered by a harrowing blow once, thousands of years ago. Both of its femurs were heavily damaged near the knees, deep cracks marring the surface of the ancient bone. Some cracks led to the hollows, some were even deeper, going all the way to the sea of ash far below. The knee joints themselves were out of sight, buried in the ash. Since nobody knew how deep the sea of ash was, it was impossible to tell if the dead god's tibias and fibulas were hidden under the endless gray carpet, or if something had severed them completely in the distant past. The citadel Gilead had been ordered to conquer was situated at the very last bone plateau, standing on the shore of the Sea of Ash. The journey to the end of Godgrave had been harrowing. The battle for the citadel, located so close to the endless expanse of ash, promised to be more harrowing still. Are you sure that we can even take it? The voice sounded tired. Gilead kept his gaze aimed across the last canyon, then turned slowly to look at his last companion. The two of them were all that remained of the expedition. His lustrous armor had long been destroyed, and his skin had turned the color of bronze under the merciless radiance of the overcast. Even his tunic had been bleached by the light, losing all color. The woman's parasol was in the same sorry state. The beautiful patterns that used to cover its surface were now faint and feeble, barely noticeable in the bright light. It was a miracle that the flimsy thing had survived at all. Looking at the woman, Gilead suddenly found the situation comical. So many brave warriors had died, skilled awakened, fearsome masters. Even a powerful saint. And yet, this mundane luxury item the woman had brought with herself on a whim was in one piece. He sighed deeply. Gilead's blue eyes were vivid and feverish, but the woman's green eyes were dim and calm. After endless days of horror and suffering, they had finally reached their destination. Now, there were only these few last obstacles left for them to overcome. The last canyon, the last plateau, and the citadel itself. He remembered that she had asked him a question and nodded belatedly. We must take it, and therefore, we will. The lower part of the woman's face was hidden behind a scarf, but he could tell by her eyes that she smiled. She had not smiled in a while, so that was probably a good sign. It's just the two of us now. Two saints against whatever profane horror guards that citadel. I'd say the odds are not in our favor. Gilead pursed his lips, then shook his head grimly. We've made it so far. So, we'll take it. The woman studied him for a while, then leaned back and laughed. Then, she folded her parasol and looked at him coldly. Confused, Gilead turned to the canyon. Let's rest here. I will carry you to the other side once we have recovered our essence. No. He paused, unsure if he had heard her right. Looking back, he frowned. No. The woman was smiling. Yes, no. She leaned on her parasol and spoke, her voice remaining calm. I was going to tell you a while back, on the day we lost half of the remaining soldiers, and you refused to turn back. But then, I decided to wait a bit. To crush your spirit better. Rao S. Gilead blinked, staring at her in confusion. What do you mean? The citadel. The woman chuckled. I refuse. Noticing his incomprehension, she shook her head. Everyone is dead, but I am alive. I am alive because you've kept me alive, and you've kept me alive because you need a homeless saint to claim the citadel. But I won't. I refuse. Honestly, I'd rather dive into the sea of ash head first. Oh, and you go to hell, Summer Night. There is a special place there prepared for people like you, I'm sure. She laughed again, sounding more than a little unhinged to his ears. Had she been harboring these thoughts quietly all this time? Her green eyes came alive again, growing as bright as they had been once, before they left on this cursed expedition. There, I spoke my piece. Now, I'm leaving. Gilead frowned, stumped. He was too tired, too hurt, and too spent to comprehend the strange situation. His thoughts were moving slowly. What was she saying? No, he understood what she was saying. But words weren't magical spells that bent reality to one's wishes. What did she expect would happen because of her outburst? We have our orders. The woman raised an eyebrow, her green eyes full of mirth. So what? You might be hell-bent on staying loyal to the king, but I am not. In fact, I'm sick of him and his orders. I was already sick before being sent on this futile expedition, and now, after witnessing all our soldiers die senseless deaths, I don't even care to pretend that I'm not. Gilead raised a hand and rubbed his face tiredly. The deaths of the soldiers weighed heavily on his soul, as well. He was sick and tired, as well. But he just could not understand. She was a saint, a transcendent champion of the sword domain, the best there was. Sure, not all saints were retainers of the great clan valor like he was. And even among the knights, not everyone took their oaths as seriously as he did. Some people were guided by greed and self-interest. Most people were simply lost. But most saints still had enough composure to keep their wits about them. What was she hoping to achieve? Were there others like her among the transcendent champions of the sword domain, ready to abandon reason? You refuse. You can't refuse. The woman seemed to grin. Can't I? What are you going to do to stop me, Summer Night? I admit, you are far stronger than me. You can kill me. You can overpower me. You can even drag me to the citadel against my will. But, even if you do, you can't force me to claim it. You can't do anything. Gilead just stared at her blankly. Then, a hint of exasperated anger ignited in his piercing blue eyes. And then what? What happens after you flee to the waking world? Do you think that the king will just let you be? Or are you planning to fight him, as well? It's useless. The woman stared at him for a while, then sighed and opened her parasol. Hiding in its shade, she shook her head. Is it useless, though? Gilead laughed. You don't know anything. You haven't seen anything. If you think that you can fight a sovereign, if any of us, or even all of us can, then you are delusional. It is nothing but an exercise in futility. The woman smiled again. I think not. He stared at her somberly, and she shook her head again. I think that you are misunderstanding something very important, Summer Night. You are right, I can't fight the king. It's hopeless. If I do, he'll kill me. But what happens after he kills me? Do you think that I'll be the last one to defy him? Is he going to kill everyone who disobeys his orders? The woman scoffed. We mere mortals are powerless in front of a sovereign, because a sovereign is like a god. His will is the divine will. But gods are also powerless in front of us mortals, because their divinity depends on a domain, and domains consist of people. What is he going to be the king of if people turn their backs on him, and he slaughters the people? The king of nothing. Twirling her parasol, she took a step closer to Gilead and looked him in the eye. We mortals are not as powerless as you think. And our will is not as insignificant as it seems. But even if it is, well, to be frank, I don't care. I just don't give a damn anymore. I'm done with this farce. As Gilead stared at her, struggling to find words to retort, the woman gave him a look of pity. Oh, and also, for spell's sake. You swore a knightly oath of fealty to the great clan Valor, did you not? Well, the great clan Valor consists of many people. Find a less rotten one to be loyal to. You fool. By the dead gods, even changing star is an heir of valor these days. With that, the woman disappeared into thin air, having pulled on her tether to return to the waking world. The vivid green radiance of her eyes faded, leaving only shades of white and gray in the world. Left alone, Sir Gilead, the summer knight, tiredly lowered himself to the ground. He had done all he could, more than he could, even. But despite that, his mission had ended in failure. Chapter 2209. She's coming back. The dark water boiled as the gargantuan horror rose from below. Its translucent carapace glistened like obsidian in the bright light of the luminous memories, and the battered ships scattered, pushed aside by the turbulent waves. The creature was too large to discern its full shape. The people struggling to stay on the splintered decks could only catch glimpses of its harrowing visage, the enormous black eyes, the jagged line of a dreadful mandible, the forest of titanic limbs, the flexible antennae that reached almost a kilometer into the air. However, the ghastly depth dweller was not what made the people weary. They had battled plenty of terrifying abominations while sailing through the darkness of the spine ocean already, many of them far more dreadful and eerie than this one. The punitive expedition had lost most of its ship in the process, and plenty of warriors, but dying in a battle with nightmare creatures was a familiar thought to awaken. The murderous demon that hid in the darkness above was far more unnerving. As the remaining forged echoes tore into the dweller of the depths, breaking its carapace with steel fangs, their riders unleashed a barrage of harpoons and arrows into the cracks. Each was a powerful memory capable of dealing immense harm. The nightmare creature sustained some damage, and while it was not seriously wounded yet, they managed to keep it away from the ships. There, several brilliantly shining arrows shot into the air from the decks, chasing away the darkness. All darkness but a small formless mass of it. The mass of darkness was falling as it twisted to avoid one of the arrows, and was then torn apart by a bright beam of incinerating energy that shot from one of the decks. From within it, an enchanting figure was revealed. A beautiful fiend with alabaster skin and obsidian hair plummeted from the sky, her black wings folded to increase the speed. Her armor was torn and broken, and her mesmerizing face was painted by blood. Several arrows protruded from her sides, slowly collapsing into a rain of sparks. And yet, there was a chilling, cruel glint in the winged demon's onyx eyes. Don't let her reach the ships. But it was already too late. Revel was too close. She fell on the deck of the ship that had been washed away from the others at terrible speed, summoning her darkness at the last moment. The ascended warriors scrambled to assume a defensive formation, the melee fighters rushing forward as their less resilient comrades stepped back. A wall of shields and a palisade of spears barred her path, sorcerous flames dispelling true darkness that shrouded her like a veil. Ranos. The pursuers had long learned how to deal with her ambushes. She had managed to cull many of them at the start, eventually killing 2 of the saints, but by now, every attack was a deadly gamble. It was too easy to get bogged down, surrounded, and cut down. However, that was all right. Because Revel was learning too. Usually, she would have shot past the deck, either severing bodies or catching an enemy or 2 to throw them overboard before disappearing into the darkness. But this time, she did not. Instead, she simply crashed into the damaged deck like a cannonball, piercing it in a cloud of splinters. She pieced the entire ship. As cold water washed over her, a litany of shouts bloomed above the damaged ship. She's gone. Damn it, the hull is breached. The cargo hold is flooding. She's in the water. Revel spun and used her wings to push herself through the dark waters. Reaching the shattered hull of the ship, she used her claws to widen the breach, then spun again and pushed herself off the enchanted wood, into the depths. Usually, the warriors of the sword domain would have been easily able to repair such damage to one of their ships. She would not have risked falling into the water, either, where the forged echoes were waiting to tear her apart. But the battered fleet was currently being besieged by the underwater horror. The echoes were away, trying to breach its thick carapace, and the ships were scrambling to stay at a distance. The vessel she had damaged would not sink, most likely, but they would take a lot of water, which would slow them down and make them a sitting duck. Then, one of the 4 remaining Valor Saints would have to make a decision. They would either have to risk themselves to protect the damaged ship, or sacrifice it. Either way, Revel would get a chance to take down one more Transcendent. If she survived that long, of course. She was not doing too well herself. Revel was strong, and Moonveil was strong as well. But it was just the two of them against 7 saints of the Sword Domain in their entire expedition. They had whittled the enemy numbers down over the long and harrowing voyage through the Spine Ocean. They killed some themselves, and killed others by luring the enemy ships into the maws of the horrors that dwelled in the darkness. But the enemy had whittled Revel and Moonveil down, as well. Their essence was exhausted. Their bodies were riddled with wounds. Their memories and echoes had been destroyed, and their supplies had long run dry. The dwellers of the depths were just as eager to consume them as they hungered for the souls and flesh of the pursuers. The citadel was drawing closer. Revel knew that she would not be able to destroy the remains of the Sword Domain force before their ships reached the destination. So, the outcome of this nightmare would most likely be decided in a desperate three-way battle between the daughters of Queen Song, the saints of the Sword Domain, and the guardian of the Spine Ocean Citadel. Whatever that horror was, chances were, the nightmare creature that had made its nest in the citadel would be the final victor. Gritting her teeth, she tore the remaining arrows out of her flesh and shattered them, feeling the poison that had coated the arrowheads struggle to paralyze her body. A powerful current threw her away as a severed antenna of the crustacean behemoth plummeted into the water from great heights, displacing countless tons of water. No time to waste, now. Folding her wings, Revel swam upward. Some time later, she reached the crack in the dome of the dead god's spine that had served them as shelter last night. Dismissing her wings, Revan pushed her shredded body inside, fell on the uneven floor, and drew a laborious breath. Her transcendent physique was already working on mending her mangled flesh, but even its staggering vitality was not enough to contend against the accumulated damage. Soon, a pale light ignited in the crevice, and she saw Moonveil. Her sister was sitting while leaning on a wall, her hands cradling a terrifying wound in her abdomen. She smiled weakly. How was the hunt? Revel tiredly shook her head. They lost 2 ships, but they still have 4 saints. She hesitated for a few moments, and then added quietly. We will leave as soon as I replenish a little essence. The citadel is only a few hours away, now. Moonveil sighed. Do you think we'll manage to defeat the Guardian, kill the Sword Saints, and conquer it? Revel exhaled slowly. Maybe, maybe not. We don't need to, anyway. Instead, we'll do what Sation and Hell did. I'll stall the enemies, you'll find the gateway and claim it. Her sister frowned. And just leave you to die. Revel studied her face for a few moments, then laughed quietly. Gods, it seems you really lost a lot of blood. What are you thinking about, fool? Once you claim the citadel, it will become a part of Mother's domain. And once it becomes a part of her domain, she will deal with the Sword Saints, and the Guardian. I just need to survive until then. Moonveil remained silent for a while. Eventually, she said softly. Can you even manage that? I am warning you, don't even think about dying, Revel. I'll be very mad. Don't show your face in front of me if you do. Revel did not respond, sensing how little strength was left in her battered body. Finally, she smiled. All right, since you insist. Chapter 2210. 2 armies faced each other on a bone plain. On one side, steel glistened and vermilion banners fluttered in the wind. On the other side, a legion of the dead stood silently in front of the somber soldiers, a myriad of eyes brimming with emptiness, fear, and grim anticipation. The eyes of the warriors of the Sword Domain were not much different, full of dread and hopeless resignation. The veil of gray clouds shone brilliantly in the distant sky, and the blinding light was making the bone plain shine as well, like the surface of a white-hot pan. The sweltering heat was suffocating, making the warriors of Song yearn for the cold snowstorms of Ravenheart, while the warriors of valor yearned for the cool waters of the Mirror Lake. Were they going to see their homes again? No one knew, and most were too afraid to wonder. The 7th Royal Legion stood at the center of the Song army. Sation was in front of her soldiers, looking across the battlefield solemnly. Cassie was by her side, silent and motionless, her movements restricted by the invisible strings of the Queen's power. The Blood Sisters, those who were still alive, were interspersed among the soldiers, their red garments standing out among the sea of steel, leather, and scale. Felice was among them, a complicated mix of emotions hiding in the depths of her beautiful eyes. Rain, Tamar, Ray, and Fleur were not too far from where the former handmaiden stood, keeping quiet, just like the rest of the army was. An eerie silence settled on the bone plain, as if everyone was either unwilling or unable to make a sound. Somewhere else in the formation of the Song army was the Saint of Sorrow. There were also Dar of the Maharana clan, Saint Ceres, and Saint Seard, among many others transcendent champions. Their faces were just as tired and grim as those of the awakened soldiers. On the flanks of the vast battle formation, hordes of enthralled nightmare creatures were waiting for their mistress to give them a command. Beastmaster herself was among them, her hand resting on the scales of a hideous abomination. Her tantalizing face was even paler than usual, dark embers burning in her bewitching eyes. She was looking at the sea of enemy warriors in the distance. The formation of the Sword Army was more organized and resplendent than that of the soldiers of Song. Knights of Valor stood in its center, and the Ivory Island hovered above. Master Sunless and Iko stood on the emerald grass, looking down silently. Far below, the Lord of Shadows was leaning indifferently on his fearsome Odachi, his white hair moving slightly in the wind. His demonic mask did not reveal any emotion, and there was nothing but darkness in the fierce slits of its eyes. Some distance away, Nephis was standing in front of a row of an orderly phalanx of heavily armored soldiers. Her slender figure was obscured only by the thin fabric of a light tunic, and her longsword rested easily on her shoulder. Her hair reflected the sunlight, flowing in the wind like a beautiful stream of incandescent silver. The fire keepers were just behind her. Among them, Sid was suffering silently from the unbearable heat. Letting out a sigh, she opened her canteen, drank from it greedily, then shook the flask a couple of times and dropped it on the ground. Not too far, the White Feather clan stood, ready for battle. Saint Tyrus and Saint Roan were in front of the awakened warriors of their clan, while their daughter, Telly, was among them. All three seemed calm, but the wind was turbulent in that part of the battlefield, betraying hidden emotions. The other saints of the Sword Army were similarly tense. Saint Rivalan seemed to have lost some of his gallant poise, staring across the battlefield with a frown. Somewhere else, Jest was leaning on his cane, looking at the ground with a dark expression. For the first time in a long while, he felt too old to face the dire demands of the world ruled by the nightmare spell. His grandson, Master Mercy of the Dagonet clan, was among the soldiers of the Sword Army. Rivalan's son, Tristan, was there as well. And countless others. Countless souls were waiting for the battle to start on both sides of the white bone plain, shivering with dread and trepidation. They were waiting for the war horns to sing, for the battle to start, and for the war to end. However, the command to attack never came. Instead, two figures appeared from the rows of soldiers, walking calmly across the surface of the ancient bone as the titanic skull loomed in the distance, watching them with a silent gaze. One was a tall man with dark hair and cold, steely eyes. He was clad in heavy dark armor, emanating a suffocating aura of dominance and oppression. A vermilion cloak fluttered behind him like a wave, its vibrant color in sharp contrast with his bleak, ruthless gaze. He was Anvil of Valor, the King of Swords. The other was a breathtakingly beautiful woman in a regal red dress, walking across the vast expanse of bone with calm, mesmerizing grace. Her skin was pale like that of a corpse, and a light smile played on her crimson lips. Her raven black hair was like a lustrous waterfall of darkness, and there was something eerie and vaguely appalling about her beautiful, enchanting eyes. She was Ki Song, the Raven Queen, the Queen of Worms. The two sovereigns walked unhurriedly across the battlefield, their human figures looking small and insignificant in comparison to the vast armies behind them, and at the same time, larger than the world itself. Eventually, they met in the middle. To one side, the towering black wall of the Hollow Mountains reached toward the sky, the jagged peaks shrouded in white mist. The colossal skull rested on the misty slopes, staring down at them like an evil omen. To the other side, Godgrave stretched into the distance. Its surface, which had once been overtaken by the scarlet jungle, was now immaculate and white, cleansed of the abominable infestations by the efforts of the two great armies. Anvil and Ki Song studied each other silently for a few moments. The king maintained a cold and harsh expression, while the queen was smiling faintly. Eventually, she was the first one to break the silence. This time, Ki Song did not use the dead youths, using her own voice to speak. Vale. Anvil responded evenly. Song. She remained silent for a bit, then chuckled suddenly. Ah, I've imagined this moment so many times, you know. Wondering what I would feel, what words I would say. But now that the moment has actually come, I find that I have nothing to say to you at all. Anvil just stared at her coldly. I can't say that I've spared you a lot of thought, myself. Ki-song smiled. Then, looking away, she let out a quiet sigh, or at least pretended to, controlling her puppet with flawless skill. After a short pause, she suddenly asked, "By any chance, do you remember the first time we met?" He pondered for a second or two, then shook his head slightly. "I don't particularly recall, no. Was it at the academy?" Ki-song glanced at him briefly. "No. It was at the party in honor of the immortal flame, I think. We were children then. So many years have passed, and so many things have happened. The world has changed so much since then, who would have predicted how those kids would end up? How the immortal flame clan would end up, as well." She paused for a moment. "Did you know that the walls of the academy were breached, by the way? For the first time since its establishment, and it wasn't by a nightmare creature. They had withstood the perils of the nightmare spell for 36 years. But they didn't withstand us." Anvil smiled coldly. "Why? Are you feeling sentimental?" Ki-song studied him for a bit, then grinned. "Can't I? You are the last friend I have in this world, after all. And after today, I will have none." He just looked at her evenly. "Were we ever friends? I don't think so. Then again, you'll be truly dead after today, and the dead don't need friends. So don't feel too sad." Ki-song laughed. "That's it. After all these years, after everything we've done, you really have nothing to say." Anvil shrugged. "Words are meaningless. They are meaningless by now, at least. Both of us have already said everything. What else is there left to say?" Ki-song sighed. "Well, you aren't wrong. Prepare to die, then. You are already no different from a corpse, so killing you will simply be mercy." Hearing these words, he smiled darkly. "Funny to hear something like that from you, of all people." She lingered for a while, then smiled, as well. "Yes, you are right, it is a bit funny." As she finished saying those words, the world shuddered. The end. Your feedback is appreciated.